Welcome to A Case for America. I am Austin Hepworth, here along with Michael Hepworth, and we are talking today about the 27th Amendment. The 27th Amendment is fairly short, and it actually feels a little bit off. It was the last amendment passed, but it feels short enough to be one of the original ones. But it says, no law varying the compensation for the services of the senators and representatives shall take effect until an election of representatives shall have intervened. And so we had this, essentially this prohibition put in place that says, you know what, we don't like senators and representatives voting for their own pay increase, but they kind of have to because they're the ones that make the law. And so this amendment said, you know what, don't vote. If you're going to vote on your own pay increase, give yourself the chance to get kicked out of office. You know, the people be upset enough about it that they do something about it. Now, it was interesting the way this is written because it doesn't fully accomplish that purpose that's often put out there where it says they want to, the people to be able to vote you out if they didn't like your pay increase that you put in. Because it specifically says that the pay increase can't take effect until a new election of representatives shall have intervened. Representatives are voted in every 2 years. And so for them, it holds true that they have to survive an election after they vote to increase their pay. But the senators are in for 6 years under the Constitution. And so the senators have the ability to vote on their own pay, wait for an election of representatives, and then their pay can go into effect. Because it doesn't say that senators have to wait for an election of senators, just for an election of representatives. So I guess solves half the problem in government, essentially. But this amendment has a very unique history to it. It was actually passed originally in 1789. It was one of the first things that Congress did. James Madison realized, well, we can vote on our own pay. We didn't really think about that. There's some problems here. So he proposed this amendment along with the original Bill of Rights, and Congress approved it. So at the time, Congress said, yeah, that's a good idea. We can't increase our pay. But then, for whatever reason, it got lost in the shuffle, and states didn't really vote on it. They voted on the 10 amendments. So states never said no to this amendment. They just didn't vote yes. And so fast forward, there were a few states over the years that would protest some things, and occasionally some of them would vote on saying, hey, we still ratify that amendment. And Wyoming, I think, did that in 1977. But in 1982, a sophomore in college was doing some research for a government class, and he realized, hey, there's no expiration date on any of these things. And you actually see that in amendments. They say, now this has to be voted on within 7 years or something, or else it expires. But he says there's no expiration date on this amendment. And the states never actually said no. So he got really excited. He wrote a paper on it about how the amendment could still be passed and submitted it. And his teacher said, hey, dude, you're kind of crazy. You just get a C. And he was a little put out by that. And so he said, well, I'm going to prove him wrong. And by doing that, or to do that, he decided to go write letters. He wrote letters to representatives in different states that hadn't voted on this amendment yet. And he said, hey, vote on it. And sends out a bunch of these letters, finally hears back. Someone in Maine picked up on it and sent it on to their legislature, and Maine voted and said, yeah, sure, we'll approve this amendment. We think it's a good idea. And then, so he got some success there, got another state, I think it was Colorado next, that jumped on board. And then he just put a few more thousand of his own dollars into it and said, I'm going to make something of this. And eventually got enough states, 3/4 of the states, to ratify the amendment. Now, the interesting thing is that there were states ratifying this amendment that weren't in existence when the amendment was passed by Congress. Kind of interesting to look at. And there was some debate. People said, hey, maybe this shouldn't be a thing. And there's an actual official office in federal government that looked at it and said, hey, we think it's official. There's no expiration date. Nothing in the Constitution says it has to be passed within, less than 200 years. And so this amendment was 200 years in the making. And it came about because there was a college student that believed in what he researched and read, and his professor said no, but he still believed. And so one of the things I love about this amendment is it shows the power of believing. It shows the power of one person to do something. There are things that get passed over in our society. There are things that we don't give enough respect to or care enough about. And the voices of the day may tell us we're crazy. But if you believe, if you work at something, there's a lot that can come from that. And so that is one story I love from the law and from American history. But it is interesting to look at, issues of congressional pay and to say, what should these people get paid? Currently, representatives, at least in 2021, were paid $174,000 a year, which for an average American, that'd be pretty good money. But it's not, I don't know if it's a fun job necessarily. And there have been debates over pay in the past. And the question also naturally arises of, can the Senate pay themselves differently than the House? Senators are in for 6 years, House of Reps are in for 2 years. Should they get paid different? There's a lot more representatives than there are senators. There's 435 representatives. There's 100 senators. Do you do more work, less work in either one of those? And these are some of the debates we've had. Michael, I think you know some of the debates through history on congressional pay, but curious about that and some of your thoughts on it.
Yeah, going back to the very, very beginning, when this amendment was first set forth, the Senate was Congress was debating this question. James Madison had said, hey, senators should probably make more than representatives. James Madison was a representative, so he wasn't arguing for his own pay. And he said, they have greater responsibilities under the Constitution. They should make more than the representatives do. I think they were looking at, what was it, $6 each day a member attended the session. So they wanted to pay each person $6 a day for their work. James Madison says, hey, the Senate should make $8 a day. He made a lot of people upset in the House, and they're like, no, we're not going to do that. So the bill went to the Senate with the pay being the same. Now, a little background for the pay, the law for a pay raise to take place has to pass both the House and the Senate. So even if the Senate was voting for its own pay raise aside of the House, they'd have to send their bill to the House for it to be ratified. So I said to the Senate, the Senate's kind of like, well, we kind of like the idea of $2 more a day, but the House didn't send it to us that way. And so they went back and forth a little bit, and they arrived at the Senate receiving $1 a day more for 1 year only. And then it went back to the same rate. So it didn't really do a lot. And it stayed that way for 187 years. So for a brief year, senators made $1 a day more than the reps. And then in 1983, for a very brief time, the House received a higher salary than the senators and lasted for a couple months. So for the most part, they've stayed the same, I think mostly because if one of them wants a pay raise, they have to submit it to the other house, and the other house is like, you don't get to make more than us. That's generally, it seems to be the feeling between the two of them. So generally they get the same rate, but there's nothing here that says senators can't try to raise their own rate or the reps can't try to. It's just they don't. I don't think they probably don't think it would be very fruitful. But an interesting, angle to think about this perhaps is looking at. We talked last week about term limits on senators and reps. If you are a rep or senator that's been in for a long time and feel very comfortable in your position, you may feel comfortable that a pay increase, you're not going to get kicked out for it. So that you might be more willing to vote for your own pay increase if you think you're going to stick around longer. this isn't to say we should have term limits or not. It's going back to the conversation from last week. Just another angle to look at how lots of these different decisions we make in government play into other decisions. So if you set up where you can't vote for your own pay increase in the current time you're serving, but you're somebody who's very comfortable in their position and are assuming to be there for many years to come, you may think you're going to see that pay increase anyway because there's no term limit. So decisions you make in one place can affect things that go on elsewhere. There's just a lot of back and forth here, but it's the other way angle to look at this, I think, is the idea behind allowing the people to vote on you if you've voted for pay raise, and then they say, we don't like that, we want you out. The interesting side of that is the people might vote the person out, but that doesn't vote the pay raise out necessarily. And with the way that politics work today, we have two parties that mainly run the show, and it's more than likely that the person who would then fill that seat, possibly from the same party, possibly thinks the exact same way. So it's an interesting way to look at it, that individual may not receive the benefit of their pay increase vote, but the next person coming in perhaps feels the same way and would keep it and would try to reverse the pay. It's kind of a lot going on here, but it's the whole checks and balances. How do you put in the checks and balances to try to avoid corruption, to try to keep the people's voice heard in government? Just a lot going on there.
Yeah, and I think it's one that maybe we don't care a ton about. I don't hear a lot of people talking about it, but it is this real interesting question of who should set the pay for these people. When you have a job, just imagine if they got together and said, hey, you kind of have an unlimited budget because you can just tax people, take it from them. What do you guys want to pay yourself? And and I look at that and I go, yeah, that's an area that I think we could see there should probably be some checks and balances on. And the founders didn't really think it through, other than potentially to say, well, if people do something too crazy, they'll get voted out. So there's kind of this natural check of, we have to keep within the bounds of reasonable expectations, because if we exceed that, we're going to get kicked out. And again, looking at it, I don't know if anyone balks too much at $174,000 to do the job of being a federal representative. And so maybe that check has been sufficient that they put in place of just, well, you get voted out. But going to the perspective of, look, we are a country. What if there was a check and balance that said, hey, Congress, if you're doing a really horrible job, we can just dock your pay. And there's some independent body that has that check and balance. It'd be real interesting to say, would we get better customer service from the representatives? Would we get better access to them at the federal level? If you could just say, yep, you have not done your job well. And there is this check and balance on you. Now, again, I think the founders knew that people would be frustrated at times with representatives. And that's one reason why they build in longer terms, to say, we're not just going to let you replace someone because you're mad at them in the moment, because that'd create a little too much pressure for them to do whatever people want. And they need the ability to do what they feel is right, even if it takes people a while to figure it out or see it or agree with it. And so there is kind of a natural tension of, yeah, what is that check and balance? And again, the founders didn't put anything there. I think James Madison recognized, whoa, this is a concern, but it really wasn't a huge concern for America. They didn't act on this amendment that James Madison was concerned about. Congress, for the most part, from what I can tell, didn't get super greedy. They didn't take a ton of money for their own pay. And so it's one that's interesting to say, Congress's willingness to show some restraint on what they pay themselves probably kept this from becoming a law for many years, because it wasn't all that critical. It just wasn't a big enough concern in America. And even for the founders and those at the time looking at James Madison going, well, so what? we can do this. We'll just vote them out. And I guess looking at it, there's a couple things. I know a number of people feel like their vote doesn't matter. But when you look at it, you say, well, your vote is doing something to keep Congress in check. This pay raise thing, it's really been kept in check by your vote. And in addition, I do believe that for a long time in America, we've had some bounds of decency that were expected of candidates and politicians, and we would vote them out. Reagan, or different presidents that have run into issues. They do, we do have things like, even look back at Bill Clinton with him getting impeached over Monica Lewinsky and what took place there. He wasn't kicked out ultimately. Trump, we tolerate maybe a lot more than we would in the past. But with this, these people all draw their support from us. And they do lose votes if they do things that are considered morally or societally irresponsible and incorrect. People will stop voting for them. And one of the checks we have, if we exercise our own morality, is to say, I'm not going to vote for an immoral person. Even if I like their policies, even if I like whatever else about them, I'm not going to support what they're doing. And we have that ability as a people. And these candidates care a lot about their votes. They're very beholden to votes because it's what puts them in power. It's kind of like we talked about with term limits of, well, we actually do have term limits in the sense that terms expire and people are up for vote again. And as a people, why do we keep electing the incumbents if they're not serving a good purpose? And it comes back to this level of personal responsibility to say, who are we? What are we? But one of the reasons I believe that voting isn't completely rigged and that voting is a legitimate source of to determine what we as the people want is that Congress hasn't gone crazy and given themselves a ton of money. If we truly didn't have the ability to vote for them and they were just going to elect all the incumbents no matter what we did, they'd just give themselves all the pay raises they wanted. They wouldn't care. And so I don't believe Trump when he talks about, if I don't win this election, democracy is lost. To me, that's more a threat. And I say, no, like, you can go argue about election fraud, and I'm not saying that there's never been an instance of election fraud or that it doesn't happen. But as a whole, I believe the system still works very well, the voting system. It's a very decentralized system. It's through counties and clerks and thousands of individuals across America. It's too big of a system and too decentralized so far to completely take over, in my opinion. And again, I look at things like the pay for senators and reps and go, they know they're still beholden to votes. We still have power as people. And to me, the 27th Amendment is evidence of that, to say we didn't need it for 200 years. People realized, oh, this would be a good idea to put in place, but it wasn't due to some major outcry or scandal in Congress. It was a college student proving a point, which again is a cool thing. It's neat to see what people can do. But I would highly encourage you to recognize that your vote does matter, and who you vote for and what you vote for. You are feeding that in America. If you vote for something with a really negative spirit, really angry, really upset, you're feeding that. If you vote for something that represents good morality, you're feeding that. Your vote feeds things. It shows what matters. Your vote starts to shape what people have to focus on, what they have to pay attention to, where those things happen. And your vote will shape politics. It's kind of like with the corporation. When organic food became a thing, companies responded. They changed the way they made products. They changed their ingredients. They put all kinds of different things into it because we as a people voted with our wallets, and they followed very quickly. And they do that in Congress too. So it's good to recognize we have powers of checks and balances through voting, but I think it's also helpful to recognize that there are some checks and balances that can break down over time, or that maybe we should consider having in place on our government. And are there certain agencies or there certain branches of government that maybe have too much power now? And do we need to create some checks and balances on them? And I'm a huge fan of looking at ways to clean up government by promoting good checks and balances. And so, as an example, here in Utah, um, we elect an auditor to audit the government and its expenditures, and we elect an attorney general that's supposed to enforce the law. And Utah traditionally has been a very Republican state, and we like to elect a Republican attorney general and a Republican auditor. And as I look at that, I say, well, do we expect a Republican to audit the Republicans? Or is there no conflict of interest there? Why do we do that? Would it not be a better check and balance to have an independent or a Democrat even auditing? Because they'd have an incentive to actually just share the truth, to say, hey, this is really what's going on. A Republican policing the Republicans through the attorney general side, if they're supposed to enforce the law, are they going to be as motivated to do it against other Republicans? Or are you going to have a better check and balance on government as a whole and their responsibility to follow the law by electing an independent that's not governed by the parties? And I say that because those are two examples of ways that those are checks and balances that are left to us as a people. We can choose to have an effective check and balance that helps clean things up, or one that's far less effective. And often we vote for less effective checks and balances simply because I guess I don't even know why. We like to follow the party, we like to do different things. But I believe strongly that if we start to rethink our approach to government and say, what's a healthy check and balance to have in place? How can we put competing interests in place to actually produce something good? And if we have an auditor that wants to show maybe what a party is doing that's not good, that will help clean up the party, right? They have to operate cleaner, better. And so we can put those incentives in place simply by the way we vote. In some instances, and in other instances, we might need to put in laws or other things like this amendment to put a check and balance in place. But those are ways that we can look at cleaning up government rather than voting for a person who's going to go clean up things. What if we clean up the system by changing the fundamentals of the system and the rules under which these people operate? And then our country can stay cleaner, better, regardless of who's in office in years to come. But Michael, I don't know if you have thoughts on that or anything else you want to add as we talk about this amendment.
Yeah, I like to expound on, you were talking about the power of our vote and how you need to continue to engage in that process. And I would like to take that down even below, this is kind of at the federal level, continue to drive that down at the state and the local level, because all of that we see at the federal level, then at the state level, and closer to home, that's all just downstream of our everyday actions, our everyday culture that we have. We build what ends up in Washington, whatever ends up in our state capitals, by our everyday choices and by our interactions with other people, and kind of what we want to see in life. And so engage in that voting process, and then think every day about how you're engaging in a life in America that's building up a party that puts forth an individual that you didn't really appreciate. How are you engaging in that process from the very beginning, so that the individuals that are going up for vote or a vote are people that you could support or you could appreciate or respect. Thomas Sowell once said that he's talking about people are usually, for the most part, they don't really like who are the individuals who are in Washington. There's always some complaint about the people that are there. They want somebody new, somebody else is going to clean it up. And he said, the fact that so many politicians are such shameless liars is not only a reflection on them, it's also a reflection on us. When the people want the impossible, only liars can suffice. So he puts it back on us and says, what are we trying to get out of this? What is it that we're requesting? If we're requesting the impossible, we're just going to get individuals that are promising the impossible, which then makes them a liar at that point. So that whole idea of voting, yeah, let's drive that all the way down to what we're asking out of our country, what we're asking out of our state, out of our community, And what we're asking of ourselves, are we just turning our responsibility outwards and saying, solve it for me, asking the impossible? Or are we engaging and saying, what steps can I take to be involved in my community, to be involved in my government at some point, so that when individuals come up for a vote, I can say, I like that. Like, they came from what I was working towards in my community. That's something I feel confident in voting for. Too often we wait till the end and we just see who's put up there and we're like, it's just all nonsense, and we'll just vote for the person that said two good things instead of one good thing. That power to vote is very important, and it's a responsibility that we should try to live with kind of every day. Think about what we're doing every day so that our vote is something that we can be invested in when the time comes.
Yeah, that's I think that's a great way to look at it. That quote's really interesting about, are we producing the liars based on what we expect of these people? If we demand that our reps go and solve all of our problems, are we then creating the liars? Because only a liar would be willing to say they can solve the problems that are impossible to solve. At government level, there's problems that need to be solved, but some of those are within our own hearts. We need to correct those things. And I even look at it where if you run for the legislature, so you're going to go be a member of Congress, let's say you're running for the House, you're one of 435 people. And so to go and say, I'm going to go fix X, whether it's whatever hot topic you want to put in there, you're one of 435 people voting on a bill. Like, really, what are you going to do at that point? Now, it's not to say that there's not some power in that and that we shouldn't elect, good people. But I know I was listening to a candidate recently. He's running for Senate, and people were concerned about, and I don't even this is something I haven't researched independently myself, so I'm just sharing what they shared, not saying it's factual or not factual. They allege that investment companies from China are buying a lot of rental real estate in America. And they say that all this Chinese investment into these rentals in America is driving up the cost of housing and all these things. And these people didn't want these Chinese firms, these Chinese businesses and investors to have property ownership in America. And the candidate said, yeah, this is a huge issue. He goes, I'll go to Washington, D.C. And he says, I will take properties away from these Chinese companies. And someone even raised their hand and said, can you do that? And he goes, of course we can. And everyone, then a bunch of people cheer for him. And I remember sitting there going, yeah, no, you can't do that. We have this thing called due process, this whole Constitution. You can't just take private property from people. But it's to your point, Michael, that if we expect the impossible, then we will just have people lying to us, because then that's who's left. And people realize, well, it's how you get somewhere. You say, oh, go do something about it, but no one holds you accountable. You have good intentions, you go do whatever. And I'm not saying that everyone's intentionally lying, but there's a ton of pressure. I know, just been running for attorney general myself, there's a lot of pressure. People go, what are you going to do to fix this problem? I say, well, guess what? I don't have the power to do anything about that problem as attorney general. You're talking about a federal issue. You want me to fix immigration? Guess what? That's a federal issue. Or good old Utah over here. Utah's not going to fix the immigration issue. Either way, no matter how you feel about immigration, Utah's not going to fix it. And it isn't to say I throw up my hands and do nothing, but it's to say there's a lot of pressure on me to throw out a response, something I'm going to do, say something, but I know internally that's a lie. And so I'm not going to just throw out that I'm going to do something amazing to fix immigration, because I'm not. If I'm running for attorney general, I'm not given the power under the Constitution to do that. We have to look elsewhere. And that's one that, but even then, it goes to this deeper point of what you're talking about, which is, I think, at least to me, are we asking the government to solve a problem that's our own? And, we'll go and say, hey, go do something about violence in society. Say, okay, can the law stop violence? No, the law never can stop violence. We can pass all the laws we want, and people will still be violent with each other. So we have to start to say, well, what's the cause of violence? Why are people upset? Why do people do these things? What am I doing to connect with my neighbor? What am I doing to create community? A great form of violence protection or defense or prevention is have community, strong relationships with people. There's a lot less violence in the world. And again, to say, are we asking for our reps to go solve all our problems? To say, give me my liberty, give me everything good in America, and make sure I can just sit on my couch and continue to watch TV or listen to podcasts, but I don't actually want to do anything about it. You go fix it for me. And if that's our mentality, that we're asking people to fix stuff for us, fix everything for us, we're asking for people to lie. And we're putting intense pressure on them too. And some people will to get votes. And that will happen. And so, yeah, I like that point a lot, to say, let's look at our own moral responsibility. So again, now that we've reached the end of the amendments in the Constitution, and we've kind of gone through that, we really want to go into some of these principles, some of these moral principles that we as a people have to adopt and live by. We can't transfer them to the government. We can't transfer them to a lawmaker. We can't put the expectation that a lawmaker does this for us. There's things we as a people have to do. And if we do those things, liberty will be stronger. The government will be less involved in our life. We'll be happier. But when we shirk our duties and we seek leisure and comfort and security and all these things that, and we want to have our cake and eat it too, we grow unhappier and we grow more unstable. We demand that the law does more for us. So we are excited to go through those starting next week as we look at this case for America and, again, law and what really makes up our society. And Michael, I don't know if you have any more thoughts you want to share along with that.
No, I'm just excited to get into the next phase of this, talking about the moral side, the moral undergirdings of America's founding. I think it'll be great.
Awesome. Well, we appreciate you guys, and we look forward to joining you more next week, and we will talk more with you then. Thanks so much.